Hello and welcome to this video. This video will cover the very basic terrain we will create for our project. So it's going to be a very simple terrain that will be used then to start building up our other features as well. So here in Houdini, let's start out with a height field node, of course, because we want to make a terrain. So this is with height field nodes. So here we have our terrain, we have our settings here, and settings that are interesting are here or size, so the overall size, and 1000 is pretty huge, and I will take around 100 for now. We can later expose this value because I want to focus on a more smaller terrain and then polish that better, and then later I can always scale up the terrain if I want to. Then also important here is the division mode. So by now it's set by size, but we can also set this by axis, and now we can fill in a specific value. So like by default here is like 512, but you can lower this if you want to. Like I want to work first on a low resolution and then crank it up little by little. So that will be our base settings. Now what we could do next is, for example, add some noises. So we have some noises here in height field noise, which as you can see will deform the terrain. And because we are working on a quite low scale, I'm going to have to also here play around with the scale and the amplitude of how much the terrain is going to influence this plane. So like this, for example, a little bit. Further down here we have more specific settings, like if you want a specific noise, like this one, or the worldly noises are always nice to have. Like here, these are quite nice. As you can see, these have a very mountain look like. This can be very useful as well. So, but I'm gonna go with a more default style. So a little bit noisy. Like this. And another interesting note here is the distort. So we have a height distort. So this node will sort of distort some of the shapes we have. This can be very interesting here. So here we can also set the amount here as well. And when we crank it too much up, it will destroy a bit the terrain. But you can see that it can create interesting shapes as well. So these are actually the two basic nodes to create some noise and shapes in our terrain. But for our terrain, I want the level designer or other artists that want to create a terrain to have some control on where mountains are or where certain shape should be. So I'm going to take down a box here, and I want to use this box as like a template model of, for example, a mountain or a certain space I want to mark. So what I'm first going to do here is I'm going to scale up the box. So it's quite small box. So let's scale up this box like this. And a very useful node is then using a projecting. So we have a height field project. This basically allows us to project geometry in our terrain. So let's here start out with our basic terrain. So we have our base terrain, and now my box is here, but my box is still a bit low. So when I move my box up, you will see that my box is now projected in the height field terrain. That's very useful. So now an artist can then go here and place down a certain mountain here, for example. Like, you don't have to use boxes. You can also use tubes. So you can have a tube here as well. And these two results can then be merged. So they are merged together. And now I have this. So this can be more of a mountain shape. Like this. I move it around here as well. Let's say I want to have the start of a mountain here somewhere. So we can mark that as well. So with the basic projection, we can get these shapes in there. Now what we can also do is subtract. So we can have a box, for example, that starts subtracting from the shape. So I'm going to copy this projection node. I'm going to connect this here, and I'm going to create a new box, or copy paste this box. Let's say I want to subtract the area here. So for subtracting, I'm going to disable this value here, and I'm going to say minimum. So it will look at the minimum of the box. And as you can see now, it's going to the lowest value over here. So now we have features to add or subtract. This already gives us a lot of control. Now, a few things that might be bothering is here we have this weird artifact because we are perfectly straight up pulling these information. So because I work in a low resolution, this might get a little bit weird. So after we are projecting our main shapes, I would like to blur this information. So we're going to use the height field blur here. And with that blur, you can see that it's blurring out all this information. So I'm going to have to lower the blur. And because I work on a quite low scale, this value can be pretty low. So in my case, 3.3 is pretty good, I think. And then after we have this, we can then again plug in our noises and distortions. And now we have a more controlled way of where everything is. So I think my noises are a bit too intense because we want to keep it a little bit more subtle. So I want to change my noise types. And I'm actually going to start out first with the distortion. And you're going to see why. So if I would now plug in the distortion, you can see that this distortion is specifically happening where we have sort of these sloped areas. So everything where we have a quite flat region, it will not be distorted. And then everywhere we have some information, it will get a distortion. So in here, I want to lower the distortion just so I have a little bit of information. So it looks a bit like a rock. And I think the default value already is pretty cool. But of course, you can increase this way too much and then have these very intense rocks, which can of course be controlled by this box over here. So this can be also pretty cool if you want to have a bit more random shapes. But if you would like the terrain to stick to your box's input, then I suggest you go with a lower value. Like in this case, 10 does a pretty good job. Then I would apply a little bit noise, just a little bit. So this is too much. And I'm going to lower down the settings. So a little bit noise like that, just so we have some information on the ground. And you can also, of course, keep stacking the noise options. So let's say I want to have a bordering noise. And now we have some bit of these mountain chunks in there. So you can choose that, get some more information in that terrain if you want to. I'm going to keep it subtle. And also a cool trick to do here is I would copy my blur here. And instead of blurring, we can have the option here expanding. And when I do expanding, you can see that our basic shapes are getting expanded. And what I would do is I want to expand my shapes based on how much I'm actually blurring. So what we can do here in the blur value, we can copy paste this. So copy parameter and then right click back here and paste the reference and divide it by 2, for example. So now when I would blur, I have a bit different result. So if I would not expand, you can see that the shapes are getting more inwards, and with the expand, the shapes are getting more consistent. So let's temporarily view my box over here, and you can clearly see that my box go over here. So when I blur, you can see that it stays quite consistently around the box information. And when I don't do these expanding, you will see that these edges will go more inwards the more I blur. So I thought it was a cool way to sort of like stick a bit closer to our original box here. What is also important to know is that there will be then a big slope over here around the box. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a little bit more interesting layout here to work with. So I just added some random shapes, but I want to make a little bit more structure. I made a very small level. So in here we have just like the main walking path, I would say, and it's like covered around these rocks and mountains. And here we have the start of a bigger mountain. So now when we blur that, we get some interesting information. Then we distort it, which will look a bit more like a terrain. Then we place some little bit noise and some more noise. So we have this result now. Then I would already place down a null node here. And I'm just going to call this out main terrain. So this will be our main terrain options. So let's place down a frame around this as well. So these are all the basic settings for our terrain. So we can add shapes, subtract shapes, control the size, add some noise, and so on. Now for the next step, I'm going to make this a bit more interesting. Right now it doesn't look super natural. A node that will help a lot is the erode node. So let's place that here and let's connect this to our network. So the erode node is also based on time. So I have my timeline here and set to the beginning, of course. And when I would press play, you would slowly start to see getting my terrain more detailed. It looks a bit weird on our viewing port, and that is because when we go to the visualization option, we can either disable the visualization or we can just click here the computer range, and now the values are a bit better. And you can see that it's added quite a lot of interesting detail to my terrain. Like it really have some more interesting details now. Now you can also see that this is also quite low in resolution, because if you remember correctly, I started out with a lower resolution. If you want to increase the resolution, we can here use the Resample height field. So we can plug this in over here. You can here click on specific resolution, and we can set this again by axis. And let's say if you want to go to 512, it will scale up to 512. What's also very important is when you increase the resolution, the result of the erode node will also change a lot because it has a lot of more information to work with. So when we plug in the information here, I'm going to click reset. And now it's going to calculate until 16 frames. So this might take a moment. And as you can see now, it has changed a lot. It has also become a lot noisy. As you can see, there's a lot of noisy things. So that's why I would sometimes like to first with the low resolution of erode, and then we can later add a little bit more erosion if you want to add some more little details. But I would like to start out first with like a low resolution of erode. And here we can also play back to see what's going on. So for the moment, I'm gonna stick to my normal resolution. What I'm also gonna do is I'm going to use the freeze frame. So this will make sure we are always using frame 20 in this case. 20 frames, I think it's too much. I'm going to go for 10. And we need to reset the simulation. And now I have this result again. So a bit lower resolution, a bit more bigger details, I would say. So this is then a first pass. What will also very important later on to bring this in Game Engine is when I go to simulation, it's currently caching the simulations. That's why I also always need to press the reset button, because it's sort of like caching the simulation so it can get fastly, so we can fastly scroll here to the timeline. For it to work in Game Engine, it always needs to reset itself, because in Game Engine, I would, for example, move a box. So if I would move this box, you can see nothing is happening. The terrain is updated here, but my erode node is not. So I would disable this option here, and now it will always calculate sort of like in real time without caching any information. Keep that in mind that for game engines, we don't want it to cache it because we want to calculate it always again. It's possible to expose this in Game Engine as well. So further on, the erode has a lot of options, as you can see. And later on, I will use the erode nodes multiple times, and I will show you a few more of these settings that will be useful to us. But for the moment, by default, I think it does a nice job of already adding some few of the details. Now to the next step. Now I want to sort of add a grass layer. That means that certain parts of the terrain will be more flat or bumpy because it's going to be more a dirt or grass layer. And a very useful node for that is the slump node, so heightfields slump. So this node is very useful. But before I can use this, I'm also going to need a mask, and I'm going to use the mask by feature. So this is sort of the default node to create masks. And now we can see that I can automatically have a mask based on the slopes. But what I would like to have now is actually a mask that is the inverse of this. So I can click invert, and now we have a mask of the more flat areas. So here, based on these values, we can define where this should happen. And we have also here a ramp to sort of blur out this effect a bit more. but I think the default value already works nicely, and I'm going to plug it in my slump, and this is already the result we are getting. So to make it a bit better visually, I'm going to use the clear mask. So here, clear mask, and now you can see that these areas are getting flat. So that means that there will be grass layers on them or dirt layers. This may be too much, and we can play around here with the spread iteration. So if we increase this value, it will sort of go a little bit backwards, and there will be more details of the rocks. And if we go lower, you can see that will sort of blur it even more out. So I actually want to increase this to around 200, I think, just to have a few details there. So we have it like this. That's pretty nice. So here I increased the noise a bit here that I have. So the more noise we have, the more of these rocks that will appear out from the grass. So with this noise, we can sort of control how much rock should pop out of the grass. So if you want to have a mainly grass on your terrain, then you should keeping the noise low. But if you want to have some rocks here and there scattered, then you should increase some of the noise values. So we have some rocks like here coming out. After I'm done with this, I'm gonna already put a frame around this. And this is sort of my first detail pass of the terrain, I would say. Just like a very basic pass of defining where the rock shapes are and where some of these grass areas will be. So that's the main thing that I've been doing here. So from here, I'm going to start out creating my masks for in-game engine. So in-game, we want to, of course, have a material, and this material is based on mask. So we're going to decide here now what our mask will be. So a great way to start is to use the mask by features. So with this, we can already define where rock areas are, for example. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to lower this value a bit, the slope, the minimum slope, and I'm going to increase the maximum here. I'm going to set it to 90. We can also play around here with this ramp, so we have like a softer transition if you want that. So we can make it a little bit softer, something like this. We can also enable another mode, so we have based on height, the peaks or curvature, direction, and the occlusion. So we can, for example, enable occlusion. And what I'm going to do in the occlusion here, I'm going to set the viewing distance lower, and I'm going to play around with the ramp here. So let's drag this around, and what we can see is that we can sort of smooth out the bottom here. So if you look closely, you can have like a little bit smoother values there at the bottom if you want that. Like in here, we can get a bit more specific mask here, as you can see. Just by combining the slope and the occlusion, we can have a more specific selection here. But I want to keep this actually subtle at the moment, so we can always later on tweak this if we need it. What can also be a good idea here was to actually, for example, resample our terrain into a higher resolution, like 512, for example. What I'm going to do now is to use another mask by feature. And in here, I want to focus mainly on the curvature. And I want to have the curvature. So we're going to have to compute the range, and we're going to have to play around with the ramp. And as you can see now, we have quite interesting values over here. And we can boost these values by doing this, for example. And I actually want to decrease these values. So I mainly want this. And this can then be subtracted from our mask. So I have a mask like that. But this is quite intense, so I might keep it subtle and do something like this. I'm going to quickly switch here to my unlit mode so we can see it a bit better. So we can have these little curvature edges in there, which will give a nice result later on. Then an extra step we can do is from our erode nodes, there are actually new layers or masks exported. So in here, if I hold my middle mouse button, we have extra layers. So these layers are exported or created by the erode node, and we can use this in our mask to then add or subtract details. So what we can do here is use a new node in the lab tools called heightfield combine. So in here, we can basically combine multiple masks. So by default, it's going to look at our masks. You can of course select other layers if you want to. Let's say you don't have a mask, you can always click the flood and it's going to fully cover the terrain in a mask. So, but at the moment here, I already have a mask and I want to add some of these values here and start to subtract them. So let's say I would like to see the debris in here and we can sort of add them. So in here, this is the debris, we can add this value in here. So it's interesting information, but not really for my rocks. So we can also subtract them. So then we give some interesting information. We can of course blur this value as well, but I think the default value is great. We can do another one. We can, for example, check out the water and see what the water will do. This also subtracted some values from this. Now we can do, for example, another layer and the sediment, for example. This gives us a nice detail over here. Let's remove it. Like you can see, it's adding a few more details there. And you can see that it's adding these little subtle details on the terrain when we use the mask. This gives us a nice variation later on. So at the moment, we are sort of finished with my mask for a rock. So I use often the heightfield copy layer. And I want to copy this layer into a new layer, and I would call this layer number 2. So in this case, I already called it 2 because my Unreal material will automatically assign rocks to 2, which I will show you later in Unreal. But now the advantage that I've copied my layer is I could still keep building on my mask for something else. So now I want to make the grass layer. And what I basically want to do for my grass is to use a remap node, so heightfield remap, and invert this. So with the remapping, we're gonna, of course, make sure set this to mask because we want to change the mask. And we can start remapping this. So our out, min, and max will be reversed. And now we have basically the inverted version. You can also make sure this to clamp this to a 0 to 1 range, just to be sure. And we of course have here a ramp to control this. But I would like to keep these subtle details in there. And I'm going to use again the copy layer node here. And this is then actually my layer 1, because layer 1 will be my grass layer. What I'm going to do now to sort of finish it up is to clear the mask. So clear mask. So we have back our terrain. And what is also important here is to use a blast node. And what I'm going to do here is blast away all the layers that we don't need in Game Engine. So the layers I need in Game Engine is of course my height. So I need my height and I need layer 1 and 2. So I'm going to make sure my layer height 1 and 2 are being exported. So that's the only layer I would like to have in the end. Because otherwise Unreal will recognize these layers and will convert these into terrain layers. But you don't want all this information in terrain layers. That will be a lot of information for the terrain only. To make this also a bit nicer in Houdini, we have a quick shade node for terrain. So heightfield quick shading. And in here, I'm going to look at texturing and we're going to look at our mask. So layer 1 will be my dirt, so let's give this a will be my grass. So let's give this some grass color, something like this. And then layer 2 will be my rocks. So this can be a bit darker gray, maybe a little bit brown or something like this. It doesn't have to be perfect, it's just for viewing it in Houdini. So whenever I would make a change to my terrain, I would also have a quite good look on how my layers are actually interacting with a color. You can also put here in a custom texture, like you can get some textures from Quixel already or custom made textures, and you can like preview some of the grass here as well. But I think this is already a nice looking terrain that we can start building up for our future ideas and tools. Now the next step will be bringing this into Game Engine and get the first look of our terrain in Game Engine. I will not be exporting textures from the terrain, but it is possible because the Houdini engine will automatically convert everything that we need. But if you still would like to see our textures from this terrain, we can use here the export layer node. So with this node, you can just plug it in from here. By default, it will export all the layers. So when I press save to disk, it will save out all the layers into a texture. And here is also the folder. So if I would select the folder and press export, I will have them there. So in here, a quick demonstration of this, we just press save. And as you can see here, this is the result. So we get a close result to what we actually are having here. This is then my other map. Notice also that it will export all layers. So if you are having this plugged in here before the blast, it will export all the layers. So it will export the water layer, the bedrock layer, and so on. It's a very useful node if you want to export our terrain data for games. But in this case, I want to go with our plugin and get the most out of the plugin.